Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS Webinar on RDA, Benefits for Users and Catalogers. I'm Kristen Martin, member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter today is Chris Oliver. Chris has worked at the McGill University Library since 1989 as a cataloging librarian and a cataloging manager. Her current position is Coordinator of Cataloging and Authorities. She received both her MA and her MLIS degrees from McGill University. Chris is chair of the Canadian Committee on Cataloging and has served as a member of the Joint Steering Committee's Format Variation Working Group and is chair of the RDA Outreach Group. She is the author of Introducing RDA, A Guide to the Basics. As the presentation goes along, if you have questions for Chris, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Chris will do her best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, please note that the presentation will be recorded, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of Chris's slides. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Chris. As I turn the presentation over, there may be a slight delay.
Hello everybody, thank you Kristen. In today's webinar, what I'd like to do is I'd like us to step back from the details of specific instructions and changed mark coding and look at the whole of RDA and look at the purpose of RDA. So I was thinking that we would approach it by looking at some of the key objectives. So RDA's development was planned with a certain number of objectives in mind, and these objectives weren't just nice sentences that are put in an introduction, but they really shaped the final product of the standard. And so that we can think of these objectives as key aspects of RDA. Now, I'll look at them not necessarily in the order of importance, but we'll look at these objectives to try to look at some of the key points about RDA that promise benefits both for our users and for us, and both for the short term and in the long term as well. So we'll start with the objective of continuity. Right away in the first chapter is the introductory chapter of RDA, which is chapter 0, and the objectives are laid out. One of the objectives is continuity, and that is that data should be amenable to integration into existing databases, particularly those developed using ACR and related standards. So right away we see that RDA was developed with the idea that it would work in the current environment and that RDA records would be compatible with ACR2 records, that ACR2 and RDA records can coexist together in the same databases. Excuse me, okay, for some reason it's not advancing, I'm not sure why. I have a frozen computer. It's funny, we do rehearsals for this and it doesn't happen. All right, well, let's try starting that again. No. Okay, there we go. Now we have the continuity with ACR2 in the sense of the compatibility of ACR2 and RDA records. But there's also a very important content link between the two. And so RDA opens right away by saying that it is built on the foundations of ACR2 and on the cataloging traditions that shaped ACR. It then goes on to say instructions derived from ACR have been reworked, and reworked is the important word to note, to produce a standard that will be easier to use, more adaptable, etc. So we see a visible continuity with ACR2 in that many of the instructions are very much an echo of what we knew in ACR2. But the instructions are completely reworded, and we're also seeing them within a totally new theoretical framework. I like to use this analogy when I'm thinking about the transition from ACR2 to RDA. If we think of ACR2 rules as the stones, An ACR2 structure, like for example, the structure of Part 1 of ACR2, which is according to Class of Materials chapters, we think of that as the framework. And we have the rules, the stones, built up according to a certain framework, and this is the end product that we see. If you take away the framework, you have the stones, the rules alone. Now, this deconstruction metaphor is not totally out in left field because, in fact, at the very beginning of the development of RDA, there was a time when the ACR2 rules from Part 1 were taken out of the structure of the Class of Materials chapters and were shuffled around in new ways, trying to follow the ISBD areas. And that began a visioning process that eventually led to RDA. Now, if you take a new framework and then you take some of the old stones, but you also add some new stones, you add some new features, but if the framework is fundamentally different, you end up with something that looks totally different, as we see here in the lovely image of falling water. So one can think of ACR2 deconstructed, and then the stones or the rules taken and put within a new structure, so that and this new structure has new concepts and a new vocabulary that go with the new concepts as well. We have some new instructions and some changed instructions. This is an example of one of the instructions where the intent is very similar between ACR2 and RDA. And in fact, if we look at the examples at the bottom of the screen, what we end up recording in this particular example is identical, one film reel. But if you notice, the vocabulary is different. So RDA talks in terms of number of units and an appropriate term for the type of carrier. Whereas in ACR2, we're talking about number of units but specifying Arabic numerals, and also used the term specific material designation. So RDA doesn't use that terminology and introduces the terminology of carrier. So we have instructions that are obviously similar to ACR2, but they have been reworked, reshaped, rechiseled to fit in the new framework. Now, this objective of continuity is very useful, both for the user and for the cataloger. We have an enormous amount of legacy data. In OCLC WorldCat, we have now over 200 million records, many of those being ACR records. So it's very important that we not forget our legacy data, and that we need to bring forward our legacy data as we move into the future. There are also a lot of good parts of ACR2 that are brought forward in RDA. The goal of compatibility of ACR2 and RDA records in the same databases particularly focus on the compatibility of access points. And so during the development of RDA, for the sort of first release, the time of transition, the changes to access points were kept to a minimum, and they're only changes that can be implemented with global updates. So for the user, this is good because the continuity means that the user won't experience an abrupt disconnect, won't have to search and retrieve within different databases. It'll be the same database of bibliographic information. The cataloger also continues to engage in the recognizable activity of recording title, statement of responsibility, edition. And also, we as catalogers will not have to sit there and change legacy records on a one-by-one basis. And those of you who lived through the change from ACR1 to ACR2 can appreciate how important this objective is. Now let's look at the number one objective. The number one objective in the development of RDA was responsiveness to user needs. And RDA opens up right away at 0.0, saying that it's a set of guidelines and instructions on formulating data to support resource discovery. And resource discovery is basically assisting users to perform a certain set of user tasks. So resource discovery is basically operationalized as ensuring that a user can fulfill these user tasks. And it's not that we all of a sudden have, discovered, the importance of the user. As catalogers, we have always cataloged with the user in mind. But what happens with the user tasks is that it's made more specific, and so they act as a more precise reference point for measuring the importance of various pieces of bibliographic and authority data. The tasks themselves are totally recognizable. We know that our users do these tasks on a daily basis. So for example, with bibliographic data, our user comes to our online catalog, puts in a search term, pulls up a set of results. So they find a set of results. They then have to look at that set and be able to distinguish between the various results and identify which ones are in fact going to be potentially useful to them. They then select the appropriate resource, and then they have to get hold of that content either by going to a shelf or by accessing it electronically. So we are familiar with all these tasks that our users do, but the user tasks formalize the vocabulary and define, and so that we're all using the same vocabulary. And there's a similar set of user tasks associated with authority data. Now, throughout RDA, we have this consistent focus on the user, and it's a recurring theme that we find throughout RDA, and that is there is the data. We're recording data, but there's always this thought about why are we including this data, and we include this data to support the user in completing one of the user tasks. Now, one of the places where we see this, we have the objectives and the user tasks are mentioned in the introduction. Then RDA is divided into 10 sections, as you probably know, and each section begins with general guidelines. Within that chapter of general guidelines, there are functional objectives. And these functional objectives are specific to the section. And what the functional objectives are is really just bringing out the relationship between the data that's going to be recorded according to the instructions in that section and its relationship to the user tasks. How does that particular set of data help the user in those particular user tasks? Now, this is an example that shows you how it is made specific to the section. So looking at section 1, which is recording attributes of manifestations and items, we see the functional objectives are the data describing a manifestation or item should enable the user to find manifestations and items that correspond to the criteria, identify the resource, select a resource that is appropriate with respect to physical characteristics of the carrier, formatting and encoding, etc., and obtain a resource. So we have the user tasks here, but they've been made specific for section 1, recording attributes of manifestations and items. Now, in addition to those functional objectives that appear throughout RDA all the way through in every single section, we also have the core elements. Now, the core elements are very interesting because they're not like the ACR2 level of description. RDA defines many new elements. In fact, there's over 300 elements in RDA. We don't have to use them all, and we don't use them in one particular record. But there is a huge element set there. And the core elements are a subset that have been selected from that total set of elements, and they represent a minimum, a floor. You should never go below the core elements, because when you do go below the core elements, it is a disservice to the user, because the user won't be able to accomplish the most basic user tasks. So the core elements were selected because they support the successful completion of the most basic user tasks. So the user tasks are obviously very useful from a user's perspective, because there is the constant focus and perspective of how is the user going to use the data. So this is obviously going to end up with data that is intended to support the user. And the opening words of RDA, in fact, remind us that we're recording this data to assist the user in these tasks. And there is the recurring theme of the objectives, and the user tasks also were the basis for selecting the core elements. So from a user's perspective, this is obviously a good thing, but also from a cataloger's perspective, because the user tasks create a space whereby there can be cataloger judgment. You can't have people waking up in the morning and saying, oh, I'm going to use my cataloger judgment, and it's random. But rather, we all need to share the same reference point. And the user tasks provide that reference point. So you'll see throughout RDA that there will be lots of instructions that have this phrase, if considered to be important for identification, if considered to be important for selection, if considered to be important for identification or access. And here we have two examples of instructions from RDA where you see that phrase in context. So for applied material, record the applied material used in the resource if it's considered important for identification or selection. And similarly for variant titles, record variant titles that are considered to be important for identification or access. So the cataloger is given scope there to judge, is this important for identification or access? And it can be dependent on the resource. If there are many resources that have similar attributes, you may need to distinguish them more. So there is the scope there because of the user tasks. Now, where do these user tasks come from? They come from two conceptual models, FRBR and FRAD, functional requirements for bibliographic records, functional requirements for authority data. And you'll notice the word functional that is in the title of both of those conceptual models. Now, I'm not going to talk to you very much about these conceptual models because coming up in the webinar series, there are going to be some webinars that focus on the conceptual models. But I do want to talk about them in the sense of why are these models so important. And one of the ways in which these models are so important is that they are the source of the user tasks. So RDA's user tasks come from the FRBR and FRAD models, and these models take the user task as a reference point for defining the functionality of the data. The alignment with the two conceptual models, FRBR and FRAD, is very important because it provides a logically consistent framework that shapes every part of RDA. It is also the source for the new concepts and the new vocabulary that express the new concepts. And it's also the basis that allows RDA to achieve the objectives of being comprehensive, extensible, and adaptable. So when we look back at the introduction of RDA under the section that says conceptual models, it says that RDA is aligned with the FRBR and FRAD models, and then goes on to say that the models provide RDA with an underlying framework that has the scope needed to support comprehensive coverage of all types of content and media. So when we say comprehensive, that's what we mean, comprehensive coverage of all types of content and media, and then flexibility and extensibility needed to accommodate newly emerging resource characteristics. So the ability to describe not just what we know, the resource we know today, but resources that may be developed in the future. And then the third thing, adaptability. Adaptability needed for the data produced to function within a wide range of technological environments. Not just data for today, but data for tomorrow as well. Now these two models, this is another aspect of why these two models are so important, is that they were created as through the work of IFLA task forces. And so they had membership from cataloging communities in various countries that are members of IFLA. They were also sent out for worldwide review and so there was worldwide consultation and feedback in the development of the models. And so what you have with the development of these two conceptual models is a developing international consensus that yes, these models, make sense and have explanatory power. So with this broad international support for the models, what we end up having is a common international language and a common conceptual understanding of the bibliographic universe. I may speak to a librarian who's in Croatia, and we may have troubles with some of our terms and our words and our vocabulary. But the minute we both start to talk about FRBR and FRBR entities, all of a sudden we're speaking a common language, we have a common conceptual understanding. So this is extremely useful. If you make these models as the foundation for your standard, all of a sudden it makes it possible to apply RDA in an international context, and it makes it easier for other communities to understand the structure of our data. Now, the other thing about these models is that they're entity relationship models. Entity relationship models have three components: entities, attributes, and relationships. And entities are key objects of interest, and so if it's going to be about bibliographic data, they're going to be entities of interest to those who use bibliographic data. Entities such as work, manifestation, person, and place. Attributes are the things that we record every day in our bibliographic records and our authority records, the characteristics of entities. So, for example, place of publication is an attribute of manifestation. The date of birth is an attribute of person. And then, of course, there's relationships between all the entities. For example, a person creates a work, a corporate body produces a manifestation, a work may be an adaptation of another work. Now, these models, using an entity relationship modeling technique for the Ferber and Frad models, is also very useful because it's a modeling technique that is used in other data communities. So it's widely recognized and understood. So if you talk to somebody in software engineering and say that your data is described in an entity relationship model, they're very excited because they know what to do with data that they can see modeled in an entity relationship model. And it's also used in other metadata communities, like, for example, the International Museum community has the CDOC conceptual reference model. And so by having this explicit model and then using a commonly used modeling technique, you have potential for interoperability of data because our data is based on similar models. Now, where do we see the RDA data model? Does it really exist? Well, in fact, you can see images of it, both within the toolkit. In the toolkit, on the Tools tab, there are the entity relationship diagrams. And if you don't have a subscription to the toolkit, you can still see the entity relationship diagrams at the RDA toolkit site in the section on background. And this is just a quick partial image of the attributes of the manifestation. And it gives you a visual image of how RDA data fits together. And this is we're not particularly used to looking at data models as people working in libraries. But when software designers and database designers are very used to this kind of thing, and they will recognize this. And for the people who are very visual, this is also an interesting way to approach the content of RDA. Now, the data model is important, having this explicit data model that we can actually see and review and look at. RDA also has a particular use of the word elements as data elements, and we'll look at that in a little bit more. And it's the combination of data model and data elements that supports RDA's ability to achieve the objectives of comprehensiveness, extensibility, and adaptability. RDA and ACR2's definitions of element are not that different. Element is basically word, character, a group of words and or characters representing a distinct unit of bibliographic information. And that is in both sides. But in ACR2, it goes further. It says, and forming part of an area of the description, which means that ACR2 elements are always wrapped up into an area. Whereas RDA moves away from that, moves towards more precise data, moves away from paragraph style, moves away from data embedded in long character strings, moves away from data stored in ambiguous elements, and instead moves towards more precisely defined or parsed, independent, separate units of data. So an element will contain data about only a single attribute or a single relationship. And in addition, there's also an increased use of controlled vocabulary, both mandated vocabulary and recommended controlled vocabulary. In ACR2, if you think of other physical details, and you think of all the different kinds of information that you could record as part of other physical details, you could be recording illustrative content, playing speed, groove characteristics, sound content, applied material, base material, aspect ratio. So these could be either in other physical details or in a non-specific note. And these would map to the subfield B of Marc field 300. But in RDA, each of those types of information are put in a defined and distinct data element. And in addition, these data elements are separated according to whether data is about content or carrier. So with RDA, you have no confusion between content and carrier, and it's very clear, for example, that illustrations, sound content, aspect ratio are attributes that describe the content, whereas playing speed, groove characteristic, applied material, and base material are attributes that describe the carrier. In addition, there's controlled vocabulary, as I mentioned before, for many of the elements. And here we see a couple of examples. Some of the elements in ACR2 right away tell you that there's going to be ambiguous data. For example, the element date of publication, distribution, etc. That already tells you, there's a lot of things that could possibly be there. RDA defines 4 different elements: date of production, date of publication, date of distribution, and date of copyright. On day 1 of implementation, all 4 different elements will in fact map to the $C of the 260. But the intention is that these are different elements and they should be kept as distinct data elements. But you will notice, of course, in the $260 of the RDA records being created during the U.S. test, that you see in that 260 both a date of publication and a copyright date. And that is because these are all considered to be important elements. RDA also specifies, for example, for dissertation or thesis information, that there should be separate elements for academic degree, granting institution, and the year a degree is granted. And you will recall that the field 502 in the Marc format has recently been updated, and new subfields has been specified so that you can have separate subfield for academic degree, granting institution, or the year of the degree was granted. So we see that more precise parsing of information beginning to come into the Marc 21 format. RDA, ACR2 had data that was embedded in areas in long character strings and ambiguous elements. And this is fine as long as the basic assumption is that a human will read and interpret the information. But as we move into an increasingly automated environment, in fact, our data is used both by humans and can potentially also be used by machines. But if you have ambiguous data or data that's embedded in long character strings, it's data that can't be used reliably to search or to limit a search. It can't be used for automated processing, and it can't be used to generate a meaningful display for users. Now, when we look at the achievement of the goal of comprehensiveness, we see that RDA's got over 300 precise data elements. And some of these new elements are because the data is parsed more finely. Some of the elements are because they correspond to attributes and relationships that are mapped in the Ferber and Frad models and that did not exist in ACR2. And some are new elements because of the digital environment. And here we have just a quick screenshot from the toolkit looking at the table of contents of Chapter 7 describing content. And it just shows you the degree of fineness of some of the elements. The other thing that supports comprehensiveness is that the instructions have been generalized. So most instructions in RDA are applicable to all resources. Specialized instructions have been reduced, and so you have the general instruction, and where it's needed, you'll then have a specialized instruction. For example, an instruction for integrating resources. There's no class of material structure that mandates that you can use an element or you can't use an element. You don't have to think in terms of, oh, I'm using this chapter, therefore I can't take stuff from another chapter. In fact, all the elements are there and available to be used if applicable. And the having an alignment with the Ferber and Frad models also makes it clear which elements pertain to content and which to carrier aspects. So it then becomes easier to go through and look at what combination of data elements do you require to describe a particular resource. And you're basically allowed to use as many elements as needed to support the successful completion of user tasks. And as we mentioned before, you have to use at least the applicable core elements. Now, the same underlying data model and definition of data elements that supports the comprehensive coverage of all types of content and media also supports extensibility. Already there are 300 data elements that have been defined, so there's a broad range of elements that are already mapped. And you can use as many elements as you need. So, and you can use them in any combination. So you come across a new kind of a resource, you may end up using a new combination of data elements. But also, because there's an underlying data model, it means that you can have a reference point against which you can map additional elements. So for example, when the Joint Steering Committee looks at further developments of RDA and wants to extend the element set, there's an underlying model that will maintain logical consistency. And one of the problems, especially towards the end with ACR2, was that there was a lot of grafting and patching onto ACR2 that was not necessarily always logical and consistent. But having this underlying data model means that we can extend the element set. But there is already a lot of potential just in the combination of data elements in new combinations as required. There's also another factor that allows RDA to be quite flexible, and that is that in RDA there's a clear line of separation between recording data and presenting data. So RDA focuses on what's the data that I should be recording and why should I be recording it. So I record it to support the user tasks. RDA is not tied to a particular encoding schema, nor is it tied to a particular way of presenting the data. There are options about how to encode and how to present the data, and these appear in the appendices, not in the body of RDA itself. Now, this causes some things to look a little bit funny and different to people. When people first look at RDA, they look at the examples, and they look a little bit different. And that's because RDA examples only show the data. So here we have recording statements of responsibility. In RDA, it's only the data that would be recorded. ACR2 often would show the example within the context of the full area, and it also showed it with the presentation standard of using ISBD punctuation. And Marc 21 shows the data, presentation, and encoding. I'm going to give you a quick example of extensibility. We're not going to look at the full set of RDA elements, but just look at 3 elements, and that is RDA's categorization of content and carrier. RDA is going to use 3 elements: content type, media type, and carrier type, and these will replace AACR2's GMDs. Now, AACR2, you could basically use only one GMD. And the categorization of the GMDs was a bit problematic because it was mixed and inconsistent. So, for example, you have a GMD such as cartographic material, which really is talking more about content, and then you have another one such as microform, which is really talking about carrier. RDA has these 3 elements. 2 of them are core, and that is because, in theory, one can infer media type from carrier type. However, that requires slightly more sophisticated systems that we have at day 1. And so, for example, during the U.S. testing of RDA, ELSI has said that they will consider media type as core as well. But the interesting thing is the flexibility, because you record content type, media type, and carrier type, so you record at least one of each, but you can record as many of each as needed. And a lot of attention was paid in terms of trying to maintain a categorization that was precise and consistent. This is some of the terminology that is used in these, and content type is quite abstract, corresponding almost to the sense with which you would access the content. Media type is what kind of intermediation device would you possibly need to access the content, and carrier type gets to the nuts and bolts. Now, one of the important things is to remember that RDA is about what data do I record and why. And so the content type, media type, and carrier type are for recording data. How you display the data is open. And so, for example, you could map that data to show a type of material to the user. You could map it to an icon. You could map it to different vocabularies for different audiences. You could map it to terminology in different languages as well. Here's just a few examples. So for a book, I would be recording content type, media type, carrier type like this. I could use an icon if I wanted. I could use a term. When I look at music CD, it has one content type. But in RDA, I don't have to choose whether I'm going to emphasize the audio part or the electronic part. I can bring out both aspects by using 2 media types and 2 carrier types. A web page and online video are basically the same media and carrier type, but they are different content types. And so it is possible then to relay that different content type to the user. If I had a map and it was a print map, a microform map, and in an electronic version, in ACR2, I've been forced to use different GMDs. In RDA, I maintain the consistency of content type in all 3, and what changes is the media and carrier type when I have it as microform or electronically. Also, when I have a new type of resource, I can add as many content types as I need. So, for example, I have a OneWeb resource, which is an ordinary textual web page, for example, or I may have a new kind of resource that combines combines text, video, music, and maps. So I can record as many content types as are required to capture all the content that is being delivered in that particular resource. So for both the user and the cataloger, you can see the advantage is that you're recording the data. You then worry about mapping to a display for the user as secondary. You're recording the data in a rigorous manner, and that means the data will stay the way it is. If there's a decision to change terminology, you just map it to another display. You never have to go back to the original data and do a global change, because it's just a question. These are just rigorous and consistent categories that then can be used to create a display for the user. And so the cataloger is not stopped in their tracks. They can keep on recording data, and the user has obviously access to the resources because we're not all thinking about how to deal with new types of resources. Adaptability is also an important objective, and it's an objective more in terms of thinking towards the future. The data should function independently of the format, medium, or system used to store or communicate the data. It should be amenable to use in a variety of environments. So as I said before, RDA is about what data do I record, and it's not tied to one particular encoding schema. It can be encoded using Marc 21. It can be encoded using web-friendly XML schema. And in fact, during the US RDA test, they're going to be testing with several encoding schema, Marc 21, Dublin Core, and MODS. And RDA is also not tied to one particular kind of database structure. If you think of our online catalogs right now, they are in fact a kind of closed database because they're invisible to web search engines. We can bring people to the front door of our catalog, but we can't make the data that's within the catalog visible to web search engines, and that's why very often people will talk about our data as being dark data. But we create an incredible abundance of really high quality bibliographic and authority data. Unfortunately, it's locked into this library-specific record format, and the web can't access and use Marc data. And also, many of our library management systems cannot fully use Marc data either. It's also not used in other cultural heritage communities and other metadata communities. You start talking about Marc format and eyes glaze over because it's not a format that they work with. It is possible to make our library data discoverable and visible in the web environment. And there is work going on right now in terms of preparing for that step with the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. They are looking at making library data available on the web and also making it machine actionable, so preparing it to function within the semantic web as well. Having an explicit data model is very important because it's a model that the non-library world can also understand. So the whole idea is to move out of our library silo and get our data out there, discoverable in broader environments, and also functioning alongside the metadata of other cultural heritage communities, such as archives and museums. But what about the point of transition? We have this huge legacy of existing bibliographic and authority data, and yet we really need to start positioning ourselves to operate in future environments. But how are we going to get there? And we can think of ourselves like a large train lumbering down the tracks, and you don't move a train easily. But you can change the direction of a train, and that is with the switch in the train tracks. And the characteristics of the switch in the train tracks is to make the point of transition as smooth as possible. And you emphasize continuity. But you also enable the ability to start traveling along a new track. So for the point of transition, that objective continuity is extremely important. We allow our users to use one database that has both our older records and our newer records coexisting together. The user is not in a situation where they're experiencing an abrupt disconnect. The cataloger continues in a recognizable activity in a familiar encoding environment, and so training can focus on a few salient changes. And also, there isn't the horror of having to change legacy records on a one-by-one basis. So the point of transition, the objective continuity is an extremely important part of making that transition possible. But then there's also the promise as we move along the new track. And that is that RDA starts us thinking about our bibliographic and authority information being formulated as data. Data that can be used by humans and by machines. Data that is precise and less cryptic. One of the examples of less cryptic is, of course, dropping Latin abbreviations, but it's also data that's precise and can be used in automated processing as well. And so it's data that can support better navigation, better retrieval, and better displays for the user. And it also offers us the opportunity to get our data out there on the web and to have our data function alongside the data from other cultural heritage communities. For catalogers, we have a space for cataloger judgment. The user tasks and the functional objectives create that reference point that allows that for us. We have a logical framework that allows us to describe all aspects of resources and gives us a certain amount of extensibility for the description of new resources as well. We have consistent generalized instructions, clearly defined data elements, so it makes the whole process of description easier, especially when dealing with new and unorthodox resources. But it also opens the potential for putting our data on the web. And we put a lot of care and attention in creating very valuable metadata. And so the potential of getting it out on the web means that our data would have greater visibility and could be used more intensively by the rest of the world. And so we can think for catalogers that our data has a future. Now, the wonderful photographs come from Flickr under the Creative Commons Attribution License, so I am showing you the photographers who provided those photographs. And we are now ready for questions. I'm going to pass it over to Kristen, who is going to do the questions. Yes. I'm not hearing questions.
Hi, Chris. The first question that was asked was, how do you include multiple carrier types in a Marc record given the nature of its fixed fields, and how to implement this? Is multiple 006 fields the only option?
One of the things that's important to remember is that Marc 21 has had some changes for RDA. It doesn't have the full range of changes because there was a very careful approach to incorporating the changes, because the Marc 21 format is used by many different communities and you can't make enormous amounts of changes to the format. So there are certain aspects of Marc 21 where we end up with more ambiguous data and we don't necessarily get as much encoded out there. It is completely, in terms of the fields that are used for content type, media type, and carrier type, those are repeatable within the description. So you can record all the different, if you have a multiple series of content types. Part of the problem with some of the coding is, of course, is that some of the Marc 21 coding, of course, evolved from ACR2's categorizations, and so it isn't a perfect match with the categorization of content and carrier as you have it with RDA. So some of the things you have to think of as sort of transitional, but the important thing is that as we move towards implementing RDA, we'll be first to encode it in the fields that are there and available, and then then to see what other changes are brought about also in the Marc formats as we move along.
Another, excuse me, another question that we got is if you could comment on the current controversy around the use of RDA forms for authorities.
Yes, I haven't actually been seeing very much of that controversy, but I had heard about it, and I think that really this is a question about maybe more that is about the U.S. test and how they're going about the U.S. test. I realize that I'm not actually familiar with, if there are particular records that are causing problems. I know that on authority records, if there is a form of the name, according to RDA, it's supposed to be entered in a 700 field. And so I thought that that would probably be sufficient, but I'm not really knowledgeable enough to know if, in what ways that would be causing problems to people. But from what I understood in reading the documentation, the authority records remain with the 100 as it is, and then with the 700 for the RDA form added to it.
Okay, we got a couple questions relating to conversion of data from AACR2 to RDA. And some people are concerned that there's not really a direct mapping and the two standards are not as compatible as they would like. Do you have any advice about doing data conversion or about the compatibility of the two standards?
Well, the question is how much are people going to change the records, and the issue of compatibility is important because they can coexist together. There are certain changes, for example, with the Bible headings, that the Bible headings, for example, are going to have Bible and then go directly to the book of the Bible. So instead of being Bible OT Genesis, it'll be Bible Genesis. But that's the kind of change that can be done with a global change. I would assume that people would share their global changes, that, once the decision is made about implementing RDA, the people who share, let's say, similar library management systems would share how they went about doing particular kinds of global changes. People might want to do a certain amount of mapping from general material designations to content media and carrier types, and there may be a certain consensus that develops that, if with this GMD everybody's mapping in this way. So I would imagine that as an actual date of worldwide of broader implementation happens, that more of these kind of things would be shared. So some of it is the question of going from Marc 21 format and moving there. And there are areas of ACR2 records where, yes, you don't have as much data. You're missing some of the data. If it's an area where you collect exhaustively and you need to make the distinction between resources clear, you may want to go in and change those and add more metadata. But in terms of the records, they should be able to coexist together in the database without having to go and doing huge amounts of conversion.
Do you have any examples where people can view RDA records out there to the public that you would recommend looking at?
I know that the Chris Cronin, who did the previous webinar, has got some in at the University of Chicago in their library catalog. OCLC has a certain number of records which you can find by searching under the descriptive convention because they've indexed the subfield E RDA. And that allows one at least be able to pick them up. And Library of Congress has some in their catalog. I know that we're receiving files of records from vendors such as YBP, and we're receiving RDA records in those files as well. So they are starting to be there for newly cataloged resources.
Okay. We have a kind of a specific question here about how would you enter a information about a date of publication if you don't actually know the date? How would that go into the record?
Well, then you have a phrase, and of course it's totally eluding me right now because it's not written in front of me. I think it's, let's say, for example, date of publication not identified. And so instead of having, if you can make a guess, there's still the possibilities of having, a probable date. But if you really don't know the date, you use a phrase that date of publication not identified. Same with, place of publication not identified, publisher not identified.
Okay. We got a couple questions about getting data out from being dark. There was one question that related to our current catalogs. There are ways other than RDA that you know of to get dark data more visible. And then along those same lines, if RDA description remains in Marc 21, do you think that that will be sufficient to make it more visible, or does it actually have to change in terms of the schema that it's described with?
Yeah, RDA itself isn't going to make the data visible, but because RDA parses the data more like other schemas use data, that's where we can move the data to be encoded differently. Marc 21 itself will not make our data visible, but Marc 21 XML might be a transition way that we move to getting our data into XML. XML right now seems to be the sort of web friend, any schema that's based on XML seems to be the kind of schemas that are web friendly. And the idea is that RDA is not tied to one particular way of encoding, and that was, part of the thing of defining these data elements, that even if it isn't a perfect match with the Marc 21 that we're using right now, the idea was, okay, but we're thinking down the line for the next steps where we're not constrained by the Marc 21 record format, so it's more a question of having data that can then be used in other encoding schemas.
Okay, thank you. I think that we are getting out of time for answering more questions. However, we do have a transcript of all the questions that have been asked, and we will, and Chris will try to answer these questions and get them out to you via email. I would like to just conclude by thanking Chris for taking the time to present today on RDA, and point out that we have 2 more additional webinars as part of our RDA fall webinar series. On December 1st, James Asher and Peter Rolla will present Don't Tilt at Windmills, an active learning approach to teaching Ferber. And on December 15th, Robert Maxwell will present Ferber as a foundation for RDA. We are planning additional webinars on RDA for the spring, and information on these webinars will be available shortly on the ALCTS website. So we hope that you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form, and please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. The URL that's here provides more information about all ALCTS webinars, and they're featured on the ALCTS homepage. New webinars and continuing education events are continuously being developed, so please check the ALCTS homepage frequently for new information. We do welcome suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities, and you can suggest a webinar topic through the link to the ALCTS screen that's provided here. Just before we sign off, I'd like to thank Geneva Chombley for providing technical support for today's webinar. She and her colleagues on the Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee make it possible to present these smoothly. And I would like to apologize for some of the audio fluctuations that was experienced by some of our attendees. We sincerely appreciate your attendance today, and we hope that you'll join us for future webinars on RDA and other topics. Thank you.